Hi, welcome to day 2 of the 2025 Hope Summit. We were just chatting before the summit started about how many people attended and how vigorous and exciting all of the discussions and the workshops were. We're so delighted you came back for another day of a keynote address and workshops and a closing. But I don't want to waste any more of your time. Let's dive right in. It's my pleasure to introduce Junlei Lee. Professor Lee is a developmental psychologist. He's the co-chair of the Human Development and Education Program and the Saul Zantz Senior Lecturer in Early Childhood Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He focuses on understanding and supporting the work of those who serve children and families on the front lines of education and social services. He develops simple interactions to help identify what ordinary people do extraordinarily well with children in everyday moments and made that the basis for promoting positive system change. Lee's work is significantly influenced and inspired by the pioneering work of Fred Rogers, who many of us remember as the creator and star of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Before coming to Harvard, he was the Rita McGinley Professor for Early Learning and Child Media at the Fred Rogers Center at St. Vincent College. Dr. Lee and I met several years ago, early in the history of Hope, and he's offered us his wise counsel many times over the years. And it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce him as our 2025 Hope Summit keynote speaker. Thank you, Professor Lee.
Thank you so much, Bob. And it's so nice to be here, to be part of the Hope Summit, and to join you and everyone around the country and around the world who are here to talk about hope, hope the initiative, and then hope the idea. And the theme that I was hoping to share today is this idea of finding hope in the simple, everyday experiences that we have, and growing hope with the ordinary things that we can do day in and day out. A lot of my work takes place with people that I refer to as helpers or helping professionals, people who work directly on the front line with children and families. And over the years, we spend so much time shadowing them, learning from them, understanding what they do day in and day out. And Bob was just talking about the first time we met. So before the summit, I actually went through my inbox trying to find when exactly that is. And it was exactly 4 years ago. It was end of May 2021. Bob was presenting the Hope Initiative in one of the advisory group that we shared together. And I had a feeling then, as so many of you on the call probably have felt over the years, that this is the story we have been missing. This is the story we have been waiting for, about human development, about positive experiences. And in the context of my work, immediately I connected what the Hope Initiative is to how we've trying to understand about human resilience over time. And for so long, I think before the Hope effort came along, we have a picture that looks like this. It is grounded in research, but it's an unbalanced picture, not just because the balance is tilted towards the adverse experiences, but because something is missing on the other side of the picture. And I think what is so powerful for me about healthy outcomes from positive experiences is that there's no longer a question mark, but that that it points us to these very ordinary experiences, which I imagine everyone on this call is now very, very familiar with, that happens in the lives of children and families. And I know Bob's keynote yesterday kind of took us, all the way to current day in terms of how we understand all of this in research as well as from community experiences. And what I wanted to share with you is how all of this connects with our work with helping professionals around the world and what it means to find hope, to grow hope in the present climate. I wanted to share first that not too long after I first learned about the Hope work, we were doing a workshop during the pandemic in the city of Philadelphia, and we had been there as a partner to support community-based early literacy efforts. And as part of that work, we were in one of the neighborhood zip codes that had the highest kind of ACEs exposure over time. And I remember sharing the Hope work with a large group of community stakeholders, neighbors, youth, elderly. And towards the end, especially after I had, just read through the questions that came from the Hope work, and different members of the neighborhood started to share their reactions to it. But one particular reaction really stood out in my mind. It was the principal of the middle school that's still in the neighborhood. And she said that she had grown up in the very same neighborhood as a child. She knew about ACE's work over the years. And she said that she always wondered, as an education leader and a professional, how come she turned out all right, in spite of the very high ACEs scores that she knew she had. And then she said, just looking at those questions, these PCE questions, she said she realized that there had been people and places in her neighborhood throughout the time she was growing up that allowed her to say yes to every single one of the questions. And then she said there are some of the people that allowed her to say yes are right here in the room on this call. And then she added, she said, I'm so glad it's not just that grit thing. And then she talked about how she came back to the neighborhood, and she's the principal here for the middle school. And she wanted the middle school to be a place with people that would help the children to be able to say yes to one or more of the questions. And I think these are the kind of moments that remind me, right, about how important these experiences are, and these experiences are deeply rooted in people and places in the neighborhood. In my work in early childhood, this was not new, except that Hope has given new language and new credibility to the idea that in early childhood, we've always felt were critical to our work. The idea that healthy human relationships begin in our childhood, that as children or as adults, our physical health, behavioral health, and mental health depended on the health of our relationships. And our work, regardless whether we're a care provider, a family, an educator, a physician, that across systems, we lay this hopeful foundation for resilience and well-being for children and families. Within the last few years, both Dr. Segi and I are part of a nationwide network of folks describing this using a term, early relational health. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, right, tries to define adversity and positive experiences in terms of relational health. And the definition is simply that these safe, stable, and nurturing relationships are best promoted in safe and stable, nurturing families who have access to safe and stable and nurturing communities with a wide range of resources and services. But as I reflect on what has happened in some communities throughout the last decades, maybe even longer, and I reflect on what has been happening, what is about to happen across many of our communities, I wonder what happens to the idea of early relational health. What happens to that concept when we strip away the resources and services? Even as we speak now, there are major federal legislations in place that threatens to do just that. What happens to our communities, the sense of safety, the kind of stability and nurturing care? What happens then to families? What happens to relationships? And what gives us confidence in holding that hope when the world seemed to be moving in a direction that doesn't quite support hope? And this is what I hope to share today, that what I felt so strongly to be reasons for hope, even in a time like the time that we're living through. And the first reason for hope is this idea that even in the most ordinary interactions that we have with other human beings, we can embody extraordinary care. And that is something that we have learned from helping professionals across many sectors, from education to childcare, from early intervention to child welfare, from hospitals to orphanages. But the one that I wanted to share with everyone today is something that was almost unexpected in our work. Shortly, we will show a video recording, but let me give the context for the video recording. For one particular year, my colleague had partnered with a mentoring organization to discover who are the everyday mentors for children in these neighborhoods. And a group of mentors that they focused on are the crossing guards in the city of Pittsburgh. And so my colleague would just spend time in the street corners where the crossing guards are in the morning, in the afternoon, just to understand what they do each day. So let's just run a short video of these tiny slices of interaction in the morning of an intersection where one of the crossing guard has been for, I think, in that street corner for perhaps 8 years.
Good morning. I like you here. Go ahead. Where's your jacket at?
Street corner.
You ain't cold?
Perhaps
Okay.
8
Where's your?
years.
I know. See, you got a jacket, huh? He said, I am. I like you here. Good morning. She's grown up to be so beautiful. Look at her. Wow. I know. Wow. She looks just like you. That's your twin right there. Oh my. Good morning. Y'all go to the high school? Yes. All right. Have a blessed day. Good morning. She's grown up to be so beautiful. Look at her.
And your lips is shivering.
That's me too. That's the worst time when my face is cold.
That's your tongue right there.
Yeah, I feel like, oh, mama, shh. I wish I could just warm you up.
But it's just like my hair so good.
My face is cool.
Well, hurry up in there. It's time to go in, okay?
Happy birthday.
Good morning. Good morning.
So Halsey, when you gonna know about the election?
When you will know if you won or not? Yeah, me too. That's the
Oh,
worst
hi.
time when my
I
face
got my
is
fingers crossed for you. Even though I didn't get a cupcake, but I got my fingers crossed.
It's just like my hair so good.
Well, hurry up
Good
in
morning,
there. It's time
guys.
to go in, okay?
Oh, your nails. Let me see your nails. All right, now let me see y'all yours. All right, now. Look at yourself.
When you will know if you won or not?
You cold. You a fall baby.
Yeah, my birthday is November.
See, I hold traffic for you. Good morning, baby girl. I like your little bun. Your mom did your hair? Tell her I give her 100%.
I think at the time when we were following the crossing guards, we didn't quite understand, at least not in research and theory, what it is that they are doing. We feel it when we watch the video when my colleague stands at the street corner, but there's no textbook chapters about crossing guards. There are not even kind of even relational theories that can help to account the impact of just 5 seconds of interaction as someone who walks across the street, right? So much theoretical work about relationships are focused on intense, enduring, lifelong or at least year-long attachments. I'd like to just take a second. I'd like to invite all of you, if you can, just using the chat, just to think about or just share with us kind of 2 questions. One is, just based on what you saw, like, what do you think someone like Miss Paula do? Like, just a description of what she's actually doing. And then closely related, but a different a question, which is to imagine, right? Like, what do you think is the difference that she makes? To the children, yes, but also to the families who walk with the children, as well as the families who are not there, but who trust their children to walk on their own to school. Like, what do you think she does? And what do you think is the difference that she makes? And I'll pause for a second just to give you a chance to just think about that. Share something in the chat if you would like, and then read what others have to share. I can see so many of the comments coming in, and this idea that so many of you pointed out that she sees each person. I think Megan wrote that, and Beth adds that she affirms the children for who they are, whether that affirmation is about a child having new glasses or just her concern about the child's school election. Melinda writes, she's paying attention to who the children are. And it's not just the attention in the moment, right? You can tell like she has been paying attention. I think about kind of when she looks at a child and says, oh, let me see these new nails. You would have to have paid attention to the children's nails yesterday to know that the nails are new today. Right? And she let children know that they mattered. That's what Erica shares. And that somehow, even as viewers, like watching this, it puts a smile on our faces. But the idea you can imagine also is that everything that we're describing here, right, most of what we are sharing in the chat right now are not written into her job description. Right? Her job description is relatively straightforward: to avoid pedestrian accidents, right? And that her resources are about as minimal as you can get. They have gloves, they have that vest, and then they have a stop sign. And even intangible resources like time. A lot of times as teachers, as parents, we struggle with being able to spend time. Well, Miss Paula's time literally comes down to 5 to 10 seconds in the morning, 5 to 10 seconds in the afternoon. And the possibilities that a crossing guard, right, her sheer presence can be part of this rich fabric of positive childhood experiences, I think reminds us of how important it is to recognizing our own work, as well as in the work of people around us. That one of the reasons for hope we can always hold on to is this idea that in the most ordinary interactions, we can do it with extraordinary care, and that people do it all the time. The second reason for hope that grows directly from that is this idea that with ordinary resources, it is possible to grow extraordinary quality in the work that we do. I think many of us, regardless what sector we're from, education, family support, or healthcare, we care about these two things at the same time, about quality, about equity. And the question for many of us in our work is, how do we grow quality with equity? You can imagine there can be efforts to purchase quality that in a way that contributes to inequity. But we are here because we wanted to grow quality with equity. But this is a very difficult task for all of us who work in communities that presently and historically have very limited access to resources. And the task has been made harder by the way we think, define, and measure quality. I'll use my field, the early childhood field, early childhood education and care field, as an example. And I invite you to imagine what the parallels and equivalent might be in your contexts. In my field, when we think about quality, historically, we've always drawn equivalence between high quality and high resource. And resources might be the credentials of the people who work there and the degree to which they're able to comply with an ever-increasing set of standards and regulations, the ratios, for example, between the adults and children, the kinds of materials, the kinds of facilities they have, the amount of time that they can spend. Sometimes unspoken is the sheer social capital of the community in which they happen to be. And sometimes it's just how ready the children already are before the children even enter into their setting. And these often, both implicitly and explicitly, become the definition of what quality is. And then, if we look at communities that have had limited access to resources, who had systemic barriers put in place to access these resources, then it's not unusual that we would find that these communities would lack access to all these tangible, stated and sometimes unstated things that we equate with resources. And when we do that, then what happens is that almost by definition, we create this division. between high resource and low resources. And we treat that as the difference between high quality and low quality. And in my field, we do this despite the fact that over the last few decades, there has not been clear evidence that these metrics of quality actually predict and lead to healthy and positive developmental outcomes for children. In fact, the evidence seemed to point to the opposite, which is that most of these indicators that we use in our standards and regulations as the arbiters of quality ended up not predicting, certainly not in any reliable and significant way, the developmental outcomes of children. But this is not a phenomenon that exists only in early childhood. The tyranny of metrics can be found in education sectors, in health sectors, and perhaps even in our political systems. And what it points to is this theme that what counts or what matters cannot always be counted or cannot always be easily quantified. And what can be easily quantified, what can be counted, does not always count, does not always matter. But it's not enough just to critique, right, the kind of metrics that govern our institutions, our systems. We have to be able to answer the question, what does count? What really counts? What really matters? I wanted to take all of you just for a second to a community that has taught me a lot about what really counts. This is a community in a rural setting in my birth country, China. And I came to this community while my colleagues and I were working to understand the quality in orphan care. And this community has been around for a few years by the time we visited. It's a small village of 800 or so farming families who became a foster care village for over 200 children, from babies all the way to adolescents, who have developmental and physical disabilities. And in this village, these farmers, who in China means that their education typically terminated at 9th grade, these farmers with few, if any, professional credentials became caregivers for these orphans. And in addition, with support of local government and NGOs, they started their little school from preschool all the way to physical therapy and so on for the children inside a revamped old elementary school building. I wanted to share with you just 30 seconds of a video that we captured on our very first visit to the village well over a decade ago. We've collected so many videos from the village over the last 10 years, but I wanted to show the video from our very first visit to make it very clear that this existed before we were there. This was not... So I assume that majority of you who are watching do not understand the language, certainly haven't been to the village. Even as someone who grew up there, I don't fully understand the language because it's in a very local dialect. But I wish I can see all of you now, because I think I would be able to tell from your faces that you recognize something in a moment like that, even though this was from a place far away, in a culture, in a language that you're unfamiliar with. So I have a question for you before we go back to the video one more time. And the question is simply, when you watch that, just in those 30 seconds, what is it that you recognize as quality? quality by whatever definition that you might use, but what is it that you recognize as quality? We're going to go back to those 30-second video one more time. So I'm going to just take a second to take in what everyone writes in the chat and all the different perspectives and expertise that everyone brings in. I noticed that right off the bat, there's this whole string of words: connection, 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 right? But then interaction, and this idea of physical contact, this idea of presence, this idea of these children feeling and being included. I see this comment from Didi that says, I can't help smiling when I watch it. And I feel the same way. It's been 10 years. It's been over 10 years, and I watch it and I just couldn't help smiling. And there's joy and so on. And I wanted to, if we were all in person, if we had the time, what I would have loved to do is I would have asked you, if you wrote connection, I wanted to ask you, tell me what you see that help you to feel that there's connection, even though you don't understand the language, the culture, but you felt connection. What is it? Or that you felt something of joy in that interaction. What is it that you feel? I wanted to also draw your attention to the fact that all of you, right, across the board, across your disciplines, sees more or less the same things. They kind of converge. And when we worked in this village over the years, when we finally began to understand what they do, we did something with the farmers, the parents, the teachers in the village that we did just now. We would collect all these videos from their everyday life, and we would play back to everyone in the village, and we would ask them the same question. We asked them, what is that you notice and recognize in these everyday simple scenes of your own life? And you can guess what they said, right? That in their own words, in their own language, they would point out that they see connection. They would point out that they see ping-pong-like interactions between people, or what we might call servant return or reciprocity here. But I particularly like the word reciprocity because it means to receive someone and to feel that you are received. And because there are so many children with different abilities and disabilities in this community, it's a receiving of all of them. And I noticed in the comment, a number of you pointed it out, right? That despite the wide-ranging abilities and disabilities in this group, every child is included. The two children, the two boys who are more physically able, they get to do their part. One of them tries to be like the teacher, and the other tries to balance himself as he tries to lean in just right and laugh at his own error. But then there's the child in the lap, right? A girl of about the same age, but with a severe case of cerebral palsy, who physically moves and functions more like a 6-month-old infant. But somehow the way she was held and how she was held allowed her to be part of what is happening. And that is that sense of inclusion, of the sense that they belong together. And because of the connection, because of the reciprocity, because of being included, each of the child had found opportunities to grow. And these opportunities to grow are very different. for each of the child, but they get to do this together in the simplest of the interactions. I pull out this 30-second video, not because it was the brightest, most spectacular moment over the 10-year history that we have been trying to understand this village. It is because it is so typical. It is so representative. Long before I had the language of hope, there was something that touched us, touched my colleagues and I, touched every student we have ever brought to the village to study. What you see here, these are not photography set up by photographers. These are screenshots from video recordings of everyday life in this village. It wasn't until we had learned from Dr. Segi's team that we brought back the language of hope to the village. We actually shared with them the hope framework to the small village in that community. And they were so touched by it. They were just as encouraged by the idea of hope there as they do everywhere else that we have shared the idea. And those experiences, learning from the folks in the village, is the reminder of what counts cannot always be counted, and what can be counted doesn't always count. That when we first arrived in the village, the city administrators would apologize to us and say, well, we just don't have enough professionals there. But when we were there, we realized how incredibly professional these farmers were. And that to me is perhaps one answer to the question, what counts and what can be counted? Often what can be counted easily, what can be quantified, what can be put in paperwork are material resources or credentialing resources that we can count. But what is so important, what matters so much, and what is so sometimes difficult to quantify are resourcefulness. And that is what people do with the resources that they do have. That in that little village, in that particular scene that you saw, what they held in their hands, right? I don't know if you can see in this grainy footage, it was a pen. It was a marker with a piece of tissue paper torn off and stuck in the cap of the marker. The teacher, I interviewed her, and she had experimented for several days to figure out just a very simple device that can get all of them playing together. That is the difference between having resources and making resourceful use of whatever they have. And that to me sits as this bridge that can help to bridge this seemingly unpassable abyss between how we think of quality and resources. That using the framework, a framework like hope, what we can do is to think about quality first and foremost as the opportunities for these positive childhood experiences. And in our work, we would just add one word to it, which is that these are positive relational childhood experiences. That every one of the hope questions, every part of the hope building blocks cannot exist without relationships, relationship between human beings. And that when we look for these positive relational childhood experiences, surely we can look for it everywhere. We can find it in places that have lots of resources. But it's important to recognize that just because a place has lots of resources doesn't mean that these resources are actually used to promote positive childhood experiences. That happens often. And by the same token, we can find readily that these experiences exist in communities that have limited access to resources. It is not an excuse to deprive and put barriers to the access of resources, but we can advocate for equitable resources while recognizing that the communities have always been resourceful, resilient, and has made the most of the human resources that they have. And that is the idea behind the hope that even ordinary resources can be used to build extraordinary equality. And the reason I think that hope can stand almost no matter where you go in the country, in the world, is this idea that in these ordinary practices, whether they're a crossing guard on the street or they are the farmers in a village, that there's room for extraordinary diversity for what these practices can actually look like. I remember an interview that I did with Dr. Segi a few years ago, even during the pandemic. I was interviewing Dr. Segi to show our students during the pandemic what the Hope work is all about. And we were talking about the building blocks, and Dr. Segi said something that was surprising to me, coming from him being a researcher. He said that we intentionally do not prescribe what these building blocks look like and what it should be like in each community. We wanted to leave the building blocks general, unspecified, because none of us knows what these building blocks can look like in each of the community. And that was incredibly refreshing to me, to know that we can have rigorous research without feeling like we have to prescribe to every community what they ought to do based on that research. That in fact, there are so many different ways that a community can come together to make these experiences possible. And right around the same time that I was talking to Bob about all these ideas, I was also learning in my own field about how that is possible, both in theory and in observations. From anthropological developmental scientists. So these are people who study human development, but as anthropologists. In my field, as they study caregiving and attachment being a Western originated theory, when they try to study that around the world, these anthropologists get into rigorous debates about whether or not the features of caregiving and attachment, first defined primarily by Western standards, whether these features exist all around the world, whether the phenomenon can be universal across cultural contexts. And these debates sometimes get quite heated in the way, if you can ever imagine, developmental anthropologists get heated about these ideas. But over the course of that debate, what emerges is this principle, which I really loved. It's this idea of universality without uniformity. That we don't have to deny the universality of human experience just because we wanted to be responsive and hold a sense of humility about cultures and settings. But on the other hand, just because we can recognize what is universal about human development does not give us the authority to prescribe uniformity to how that is done. And the anthropologists used this really interesting concept to help explain kind of how we can think about that. They use two terms. One is function, and the other is form. Function simply means you're meeting the developmental need of another person, let's say a child. Form is how you go about doing it. And I believe what they try to describe is that there are universal functions for children, for human beings all around the world. Like the idea that we needed to be loved, we needed to give love, the idea that we need to be connected to other human beings in our community and that they would accept us, the idea that we wanted to be connected to our land, to the air we breathe, to the trees around us. Like all these things, you can think of them as universal. But how we do it does not have to be. And one of the challenges that the anthropologists argued is that we often use limited definitions of the form while overlooking the sheer diversity of how people actually meet the function of development. And in our work over the years, we tried to develop tools that can bridge this function and form divide, that can both recognize the universal developmental needs and at the same time not add our own prejudice and values onto the form that it would take. And we call this work simple interactions. And this is to recognize that by understanding and looking deeply at the simple everyday interactions, we come to understand the basic building blocks of developmental relationships. And all that means is that human relationships that supports healthy development. And of course, these relationships are the very bedrock of every aspect of the positive childhood experiences. I wanted to give just a very quick example of how we can find this balance of understanding ordinary practices, but embrace the diversity of these practices. For example, in our tool, you notice that we have very few words. In fact, every time we change a setting, we ask professionals in that setting to help us to change the words to what meets their community. But let me just point to something relatively simple. All of you, when you watched the video earlier, so many of you immediately wrote the word connection, connection, connection. That's one of the first things that hits us as human beings. And often, if we think about connection, we think about a picture that looks like this, right? And that was how we developed the tool about 15 years ago. We just assumed that connection looks like this. Any of you have been involved in any kind of assessment form about quality of interactions, you might have seen terms like positive affect, smiling, etc., etc. But then as we worked across contexts and cultures, both the diversity of cultures and contexts in the United States and the context around the world, we find, wait a minute. Yes, of course, when people look like that, they're connected. But there are lots of times where people are connected where they don't look like that. They can look very serious. They can look almost flat, matter of fact, but they're still connected. So then we decided that we got to change the diagram. We just added this blank space. But the implication is that let's not prejudge what a connection looks like. Let's just be open to what the connections can look like. Furthermore, in case you notice, there's these odd letters that we write in the corner of these pictures. We don't write ratings. We don't put numbers on them because the moment you assign a rating, you're saying that a higher rating is always better than the lower one. Well, I'm just going to use an example. What if the connection looks like this, where two people don't match? Should that get a lower score than the one that matches? Well, as parents, as caregivers, as teachers, we can count many, many moments where our connections don't quite match with a child. Think of a child who's dropped off at preschool and didn't want to be there. Think about the interaction the teacher has with that child in that moment. But can we say, though, can we say that a moment like that does not have developmental impact or a positive one? I don't think we can. I think there are lots of contexts in which moments like that, even moments where, let's say, we're not happy with each other. How many parents in your lives have moments where you're not happy with your child and your child's not happy with you? But let's not deny the developmental possibilities of these moments. And that's the intent of tools like that. Not putting our values into these interactions, but rather open it up so that people have an opportunity to discover, to discuss, and to understand what their relationships look like in their communities. For any of you who have interest to pursue further, our website is called Simple Interactions. All of our resources and tools are developed in the same way that the HOPE team does theirs, which is open access public domain, so that whatever resources that are there are open to be shared, to be modified, to be adapted to meet the needs of whatever community there are. And it is in the course of this kind of work that we start to understand, at least in early childhood, the importance of not just any ecology, but a relational ecology. That an ecology that fundamentally strengthens and builds relationships across every point of intersection for children, for families, between children, and between families. We never know when and where a family needs the support of a professional, what kind of professional, or when the family needs the support from other families. But that if we build a kind of a system, a kind of ecosystem, where no matter where families go, they encounter these relational experiences, not just the positive childhood experiences for children, but every single one of those building blocks in HOPE, we can think of them in terms of the positive experiences for families, for adults. And it is even more important that we hold that vision in mind in a world where the resources and services may be shrinking. To know and trust that in the very ordinary things we do, that we embody reasons for hope with our care, with our resourcefulness, and with the shared diversity of who we are and what our communities can become. And Bob yesterday ended his talk with this image of these trees that seem to reach up to the sky and connect with each other as the embodiment. The last few months, the image that comes to my mind are these very ordinary looking marshlands that in the New England area, it doesn't take very far to drive to a quiet part of the coast and just see these very ordinary marshlands. They're not as spectacular as beaches or mountains and cliffs, but they serve as such an important protective buffer for everything they hold inside and everything on this side of it. If you could imagine, in the moment of a storm, in the moment of tidal waves, these marshland can't stop the rain, they can't stop the tide, but what they do is, even the highest tide hits the marshland, the tide, the force and the strength of the disruption gets diluted and softened so that everything within that environment is protected. And I think of the work of helping professionals that we have encountered all over this country and all over the world. I think of them, right, as the marshlands for the children and families in their care. And it is critically important as we hold on to that sense of hope that we remember that we cannot build a world in which we make a difference on children unless we cared for the caregivers and that we help the helping professionals at the same time. Whether it is research or whether it is common sense, there's no way that we make any impact on children in ways that lasts if we skipped over the adults in the middle. And what that means is that in each of our work, particularly in times that are particularly difficult, that we can advocate and ask this question: how can our practices, our programs, our policies help to encourage, enrich, and empower the human relationships around children, around families, and around all the helpers that are around them? We need to ask that question always, but we need to ask that question in particular during times where resources may be becoming more scarce, when families may not feel safe. That it is us together recognizing the power of our relationships and how these relationships become the very foundation of positive childhood experiences. And I so believe that we have reasons for hope, even in times like this, because in every ordinary interaction is the possibility of expressing extraordinary care. That with ordinary resources, we can still strive for the kind of extraordinary quality that defies conventional definition. And that ordinary practices has always embodied extraordinary diversity all around the world. Let me just end on that note. And I am filled with hope, but I'm just so glad to be able to contribute to the hope movement.
Junlei, I just want to thank you so much for that. And I was sort of profoundly affected by what you said, and you talked about the concordance of feelings. And I think I and many of us were smiling watching the crossing guard and the village in China. And the idea of universality without uniformity is so important to the work that you do and to why the Hope Framework seems to resonate with so many people. I want to thank you so much for your thoughtful keynote, and I look forward to working with you and continuing this discussion for years to come. Thank you so much for your work and for your keynote today.
Thank you, Bob.
Work seems to resonate with so many people. I want to thank you so much for your thoughtful keynote, and I look forward to working with you and continuing this discussion for years to come. Thank you so much for your work and for your keynote today.
Thank you, Bob.
Work seems to resonate with so many people. I want to thank you so much for your thoughtful keynote, and I look forward to working with you and continuing this discussion for years to come. Thank you so much for your work and for your keynote today.